Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of Miss J's It's About Time podcast. Thank you so much for joining. For those of you who've subscribed since we started the series, I thank you very much, and I hope that as we continue to grow the community, we'll continue to have deeper conversations and engagement. And I really look forward to a time when I can hear from you and tell me the kind of things you'd like us to discuss. But the plan that I have for us is sort of for me to start sharing some of the things that I have experienced in my journey as a mother, in my journey as trying to build a career, and then we get to a point where we can also start seeing whether these things have been relevant and have been similar to you, and we can have amazing discourse. So today's episode will be the second part of the career decisions session that we started a couple of weeks ago. I believe that was the first episode that we had. And today, in part 2 of this session, I'd like to just tap into some of the questions that I've received from many people around working in the nonprofit sector, aka the NGO world, particularly from people who have built a career in the private sector or in other areas of work and are looking to make an entry into the nonprofit sector. Those questions have been many. Many of them have been skewed from a position of people wanting to work in communications, which is a field in which I've worked for almost 20 years. But many of those questions asked by those people seeking to work in comms, I believe would be similar, especially with people who are also looking to work in other areas, say finance, what typically in the NGO sector is called support function. And I put that in quote because there's been a lot of discussion around calling it a support function, yet it's still a fundamental function. There's still fundamental functions. So these are things like finance, HR, administration in the NGO world, in the nonprofit world, but serving ultimately the goals of delivering on programs or whatever the ambition of a development organization is. So having worked in this space for, let's say it's actually 20 years, some of the lessons that I've learned have been life-changing in terms of informing my work, but also sort of helping me define what I find is my purpose and what I find is my value in this setting. But before we get to that, I'd like to share with you some of the questions that people have asked me around being in the NGO world and what I have always asked in terms of questions to really assess and gauge whether you really understand, whether these people really understand what it means to work in the sector. Some of the reasons that people have given for wanting to work in the NGO world or the development space is, number one, that there's a lot of money. Number two, that the work pressures in this sector are not necessarily very intense, and therefore almost implying that people in the sector sort of coast through work. And then the third thing is also around wanting to give back and wanting to contribute to social good. I want to break down those 3 issues based on my experience and what I've seen happening. Does the NGO world pay better than any other places? Yes and no. And I would say this in the sense that when I started working in this particular sector, I started at entry level. Entry level in my space in communications, that's a communications assistant. So in admin, it will probably be like an administrative assistant, a finance assistant in these areas. It could also be a program assistant. So that's entry level work. And at that point, this was many years ago, of course, the pay wasn't as ideal, but for the kind of work that you did, I tend to believe that it was relative to the amount of work. And as I've grown in the sector, I've realized that the rationale behind paying people more depends on scope, complexity of work. Are you leading a team? Do you work in multiple locations? Things like that. So those are some of the considerations. So for entry-level positions, and I believe for many of these positions, the NGO world will pay you the equivalent of the value that you bring. Not to minimize the role of people in assistant positions, because I've been there, done that, but the complexity of the job isn't quite there. They're almost routine, regular tasks that you would do, but therefore you get paid based on what you're bringing and the value you're bringing in. So that said, that means that as you grow through your career and as you progress through your career in the sector, it means that if you then find a particular niche and value that you will bring. So in my case, I moved from a communications assistant, went into e-communications. This was in 2007 thereabout, and e-communications then in the sector was around being able to develop a website and maintain it, update it with content, meant a lot of technical learning on the back end of how do you manage your content management systems, how do you develop e-newsletters, including the writing to some extent, because the writing often relies on other people who are designated technical writers or writers within the organization. But it requires you to have a significant level of technical skill around how you manage websites. So website management, including understanding what content management systems are, what are in use, how do you ensure that you use those tools to optimize the website as you update it with content, things like that. So then sort of moving a step further into deepening some level of technical expertise. Then now moving on into that, I think after that, I moved on into management, and that brings a whole set of capabilities and technical requirements for you. I advanced my skills in different areas, including going through a leadership development program that made me understand elements around strategic thinking, strategic management, people management, financial management, and I remember this one particular course called Financial Management for Non-Finance Managers, which becomes useful, especially when you're developing budgets and things like that. So as your responsibilities grow, you then grow into building a team, the people who look up to you, people you are responsible for, you're responsible for their work, for their outputs, and the pay then increases. You see, so it's a natural sort of progression. So if you then enter the development space as a program assistant or as a comms assistant and stay there, then your responsibilities will still be pretty much the same. Yes, you will have the benefit of cost of living adjustments, merit increases based on performance if you work for an organization that has that kind of rewards and recognition system. But as long as the work that you're doing is limited within the constraints of being at an assistant level, then you'll certainly not see your pay increase significantly. But as you grow across the different steps within the organization, then you're likely to see an increase. And I want to say that over time, I think pay and reward structures in the NGO space have really changed. They've really improved. I think a lot of it has also to do with the narrative that's going on globally around development aid as it is, because a lot of these non-profit organizations and NGOs are funded externally, many of them through foreign aid, so the likes of the US government, through USAID, PEPFAR, you have the Global Fund, all these big funding entities and big funding organizations are primarily what runs the sector. And more recently, we started to see a lot of interest from philanthropic organizations, which I will unpack at some point because I have significant experience in that space and what it means for them when they're thinking through how the organizations that they work with adequately remunerate the people who work for them. So that's something we'll unpack a little later. But is there money in the sector? There is money, but money comes and money will change as you grow. So it means that you cannot afford the luxury of sitting pretty and thinking that the money will come. You have to put in the effort. You have to enhance the skills. You have to be intentional about your growth within the organization. And even if it's not within that organization, as you're looking for prospects or moving from one NGO to another, or one non-profit organization to another, then the things you should be asking yourself are, what additional skills am I bringing to this organization? And will those skills that I have make me an ideal candidate for this role? Because then if you are, then you will get paid for it. So that's demystifying the money element. But the other thing I'd really like to say is that I have found that money is great. Money helps us do very many things. But because this is a sector that is many a times looking to change people's lives, you need more motivation than that money or what you get to take home at the end of the month or at the end of the year. And I have found that being very important because things do get difficult, things do get hard. You have to navigate very complex situations sometimes, depending on this particular area you're in. For many years, I've worked in the health development space, and the complexities of health development are immense because if your intention is to create social good, then you'll find that social good involves a lot of changing people's attitudes, changing behaviors, increasing their knowledge levels around. We saw it in the COVID pandemic, proper hand washing techniques, and things that will allow people to make informed choices. And because all these things are hinged on an individual's behavior, which you can then cascade onto an entire population, an entire community, some of these things take time. And the donors will give you money to reach X number of people in 5 years. If you do not reach X number of people in 5 years, then it means that that work was not a success. But reaching people is one element. It's reaching them, yes. We reach them with messages, we reach them with information. But a lot of the development sector now is moving to measuring impact. Can we sustain this changed behavior, or can this knowledge that we've passed on translate into sustained change in either behavior, in attitudes, in practice? And that then becomes the measure of success. So it's not easy peasy, breezy breezy that you can just say, yes, we've reached 25 million people, which is what you give us money for. But donors and funders who typically give money to these organizations want to see that you can demonstrate the ability to sustain this change, sustain this behavior, because then ultimately it means that less and less funding needs to go into that particular area, and these funders can actually focus their resources in other untapped areas, in other elements of life. So if you're in the NGO sector or you're looking to get into the NGO sector, we're getting to a space where it's not about numbers reached, it's about impact, it's about deaths averted, it's about the number of people no longer, the reduction in incidence of certain diseases. There's a lot more focus in being able to measure those things from a funder's perspective that really then becomes a game changer in even the attitudes and the behavior of the people who've worked in the sector. Because now you really need to make sure that beyond just doing the task, that you can effectively measure the sustainability of this impact, because then that will have an implication on the next time you're submitting an application for another funding round. So those are some of the things that have sort of changed in the perspective of the money conversation. That said, the money conversation now also goes beyond just what you take home as an individual, what hits your bank account. It becomes more about how much money is actually coming into this development organizations, nonprofits, NGOs from funders. You realize that with everything that's happening around us in the world, that priorities from donors and funders continue to shift with each day. So you'll find that areas that were historically very well funded by development partners, by foreign organizations, and through development aid, the funding pool continues to shrink as priorities shift. Climate change, which many people say is not real, is a big area of funding. So if you do not think as an individual that climate change is real, what will tell you that climate change is a priority is the shift in government priorities, in funding priorities from donors. So you'll find a lot more donors are putting money in, taking money from things like sexual reproductive health and rights and moving it into other areas such as that, mitigating the effects of climate change, but then also looking at elements around enhancing governance, working with governments to really institutionalize proper governance practices that will allow them to not only just on one end to generate more revenue internally to take care of the needs of their people, but also that they are good stewards of the resources that are available from this funding organization. So there's been some, and those are just a few of them. There's been quite a lot of shift in how organizations and funders who've typically given money to the NGO sector are now reorganizing their funding and ensuring that a lot more money goes into things that will help build the capacity of governments that receive aid to, number one, increase their commitment and their financial commitment towards implementing this program. So that means that these things are government-led. That means that if you're in the NGO sector, some of the places you may eventually end up finding yourself out of a job, and one of the places that could work for you would be the government sector, because the government then will continue taking on a lot of these programs for sustainability efforts. That's one thing. But the other thing is also that with sort of a shrinking pool of resources from funders, those funders who are still giving money to some of these areas have really significantly increased their measures of success. So what success looked like 10 years ago in the HIV space, in the sexual reproductive health and rights space, is very different from what it is. Back to what I said earlier, they're looking at sustainability of impact. They're looking at how they can rely on the results that you demonstrate and document to make decisions of diversifying their funding into other areas, which a lot of the times will be things that you've learned when you're implementing a program. So you're trying to improve contraceptive access for a local community, and you realize that yes, the local health facilities have these commodities, be it your no plant or whatever family planning commodities they are, but then people are not using them. So why are people not using them, and yet they're available? Then sort of breaking down the underlying causes. And if you really want to be a valued professional in that space, then you understanding the connection between these things is important, and that's what will make you more prolific and make you a lot more value adding to the whole ecosystem of development. So it goes beyond the money. It's not just about what gets into your bank account. If you're really invested in creating change and creating sustainable change, then you really need to work in an organization or in an area of work where you can really see sort of that gradual, that progression from point A to point D onwards to point Z, and being able to capture what that means in terms of changing the lives of an entire community and an entire ecosystem. That's one. I mean, that's just slightly touching on the money element. So yes, NGOs pay well, but I wouldn't say they pay better than the corporate world. It will depend on what organization you work for, what area of work you're in, what you bring in as your technical expertise, and therefore you will get paid relative to what the value that you're bringing in. So that's one thing. But the other thing is also that if you want to work in the sector, then let your decision really be informed by a larger drive than just the money. Money is not going to keep you happy. There'll always be somebody somewhere who's making more money than you are. So if that is your primary motivation, then you may need to check yourself, because you will constantly be looking for that place that pays you more. And ultimately, that's not necessarily a good thing for you, because if you're in an organization for a year, barely a year or 6 months, I've seen that quite a bit, people moving on to the next job, it also dents your credibility, right? Can you be trusted to be somebody who has staying power, who will stay and help us deliver on our objectives? Because when employers are hiring, they also want somebody who will come and be committed and dedicated to their work, not constantly looking at who is going to have the next big paycheck for them. You have to demonstrate your value long enough. And if you demonstrate your value, and I'll be very honest, I know there are many issues around how decisions are made in organizations, but what I have learned from my experience, do good work, and you will get rewarded for good work. So yes, the money will follow. Do good work, the money will follow. And doing good work means be committed to the cause. Think about the person you're ultimately trying to serve. If you put that person as your focus, then all these other things will come. That's one thing. So that's the money element, sort of helping to demystify that. The second thing is that people in NGOs in the development sector don't have a lot of work. That's a lie. That is a lie. And especially if you are intentional about making money in the sector, it means that you're responsible. Back to what I said, increased pay will mean increased responsibility. It will mean that you're now either responsible for a team or you're managing a project that's operating in multiple sites, meaning you're engaging with multiple stakeholders, meaning that the risk of the work that you're doing significantly increases. If something goes wrong, it could unravel so many things. So, with increased responsibility, increased pay comes increased work. That's just the reality. So, it is not, I think we need to demystify the fact that people who work in the development sector do not have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do, especially as you rise through the ranks and go into sort of people management or even just portfolio management. If you're managing, say, you're responsible for a finance department or you're responsible for an admin department, your responsibilities increase. The risk that comes with you not doing your work increases. You will get rewarded for it for sure, but so does the work. So I just want to demystify that. It is not different than it is in the corporate sector. And then the other thing that people have cited as reasons as to why they want to work in the development space is giving back. Perfect reason. I wish, in fact, anytime I ask someone, I'm like, so why do you want to make a shift from the corporate sector into the NGO world? Most people will say the money, but there'll be a couple of people who say, I have spent X number of years in the corporate world. It's all about the bottom line. It's about the profit at the end of the year and all those things. I feel that I was put here to do a lot more. Then that would be a good reason for you to get into the space. But it's not enough just to say, I want to work for an NGO. Think about your skill set. Think about the things that you're good at. Package that as something that will bring value to an NGO. You'll realize that now the NGO sector, and especially having worked in the philanthropic space, the philanthropic funding space, you'll find that the accountability requirements that come from being funded by a philanthropy are very different from those that come from being funded from, another traditional funder. Very different. Philanthropies will require you to demonstrate a lot more impact. Philanthropies want people who think like the way the philanthropists think when they're making your money. So here, think about Bill Gates, think about your likes of Jeff Bezos and all those guys. The way they operate their businesses that allow them to make surplus that then they reinvest in philanthropy is sort of the same philosophy, same thinking that they would expect from how they make their money. So when they're investing money into social good, they want to see that you have the best, you're achieving optimization of these resources. You have super efficient systems that will allow you to do a lot more with less and things like that. So especially for those who are looking to move from the corporate sector into the development space, those are some of the things that you can bring in as added value. What you've learned from years and years of work in the corporate space to make a profit. How can you then use that same skill set to maximize impact in terms of social good and social capital and things like that? So those are some of the things that I normally challenge people to think through. And if you don't yet know it, then you're probably not ready for it. So think through your expertise, your skill set, your experience, and how you could possibly package that into adding value to an organization that's working in the nonprofit element. So those are sort of the three main reasons that I've had why people want to work in the space. But back to the issue around how the space is changing. Donors are requiring a lot more accountability, demonstration of impact, and as a result of that, if you cannot adequately demonstrate impact, then it means that you reduce the chances of you getting another grant or getting additional funding to continue this work. So what that means is that it has a ripple effect. You'll find that quite a number of organizations seasonally will either downsize, so you have a 5-year project, $40 million for 5 years. This organization goes in, hires 100 plus staff midway through the implementation. So say at year 2, the donor comes back and says, oh, because of changes in either government, priorities or policy, we are cutting back on the funding. You will have $5 million to complete this program over a period of another 2.5 years. That means that then management of these organizations have to make decisions. We still need to deliver, and many a times you'll find that a lot of the deliverables or what the donor wants you to achieve doesn't change much. You just have a lot less to do what you are expected to do in the first place. So many a times these organizations tend to cut back in terms of staffing. They reprioritize activities, reprioritize, maybe scale down the level of activities that they wanted to do, so then they can still achieve some level of success. If you want to work in the development sector, one of the things you need to know is that if the organization you're working for is purely donor funded, then you can anticipate some of these shocks along the way. So job security is a little iffy, to be honest. And in an instance where you're working for an organization that has projects where they've been asked to cut back on funding, the requirement is that they cut back on funding. Many a times, as much as you can avoid it from a management perspective, ultimately you end up cutting back on staff. So depending on where you are and the value you bring into this organization, then you could find yourself on the chopping board in terms of losing your job. So those are some of the other things you need to think about. The development space, especially if you go to work for an organization that is 100% donor funded, it means that you are not immune to some of these shocks that come with decisions that are made by donors and funders. And a lot of the time, these are not things you negotiate. These are not things you negotiate with the donor. The donor says, unfortunately, this is where we are. We have to cut back. And sometimes you've even had decisions made by donors that have meant that projects and programs shut down completely midway through implementation. So that means you'll have dozens of people without work, dozens of people who are uncertain about what this decision would mean for them. So plenty of anxiety. That's another thing that you can expect in this space. And it happens a lot more in the development space than it does in the corporate space, in my experience. And so those are some of also the risks that you need to think through when you're making some of these decisions. And it's not to mean that these risks cannot be mitigated, but if you're a person who's excellent at writing proposals, or somebody who's excellent at putting ideas on paper and being able to justify or put up a case as to why your idea is better than this other idea, then that kind of skill set is what the sector needs. And it means also that then we are looking into other alternative sources of funding. So do you have a good relationship with the private sector? You understand private sector and their either sustainability programs or programs around corporate social investment? How can you then bring that expertise, that knowledge from this world into helping widen the resource basket for NGOs, not only just securing yourself a job, but in the same space, being able to continue doing the good work that you have said is the primary reason why you want to move from one sector to another. So those are some of the things to think through and some of the considerations. I think for people in my field, which is the area of communications, one of the things that I've learned now is that it's not enough for you just to say, I'm a social media expert and I'm going to post, I have excellent social media management skills. To be honest, we can all do social media management to an extent. But what will make you unique in your area is your understanding of how to measure the impact of sharing content on social media. How does it translate into, if it's something around advocacy, how does that translate into offline advocacy? Are you somebody who can help an organization think through how do you translate social media success, especially when you're advancing certain issues and topics online? How does that translate into offline traction? That's the kind of value that NGOs are really looking for right now. How can you help them translate all this online collateral and goodwill into day-to-day meaningful conversations in person? If you're the person who has that skill set, then yeah, the sector really does need that kind of skill set. The same thing that comes with people who are excellent at doing website management and things like that. We're going beyond number of visitors, returning visitors or first-time visitors and things like that into how do you ensure that all this information that's shared online is relevant, is useful, is a kind of information that people are looking for when they visit your website. And what does that mean for offline engagement or offline conversation? I honestly think anybody who works in the digital space needs to have a metric, a KPI for how that translates into offline engagement. Does that mean you give leads to people who do, to other people within your team and then see how you can cultivate that, especially when you're working fundraising? Those are some of the things that will really be useful and meaningful for you to really advance, not only just enhance your value, but also make more money. Remember, that's what you said. You want to work in the NGO sector because you make more money. Those are some of the things you need to think about. And I think finally for today's session is to say that the NGO world, the nonprofit world, the development world, whichever phrase you want to use to describe it, is not devoid of its challenges. I have worked in communications, then moved into policy advocacy, and I'll be honest, change takes time. Change takes time, and it can be so frustrating. Things that you believe and your organization stands for, that you stand for as an individual, and will change people's lives, because your intention is also to change people's lives. And then when you reach out to the decision maker, the policy makers, whoever they are, at county, be it county leaders, be it national government leaders, and for whatever reasons, and I will not go into those reasons because there are diverse reasons why governments make one decision or not the other in terms of policy, direction, and guidance. And you just cannot for the life of you understand why it's not obvious. As much as you've checked all your boxes, you have an entire civil society movement advocating for one thing. You've managed, in your role, you've managed to bring all these very unique individuals, unique organizations to rally behind one thing that will change the face of many people. But then you have a government that pushes back, or you have policy leaders that says, that's not how we do things, or that's not how we're going to do it. It can be frustrating. A number of times I've wanted to pull my hair out because I'm like, who are we serving? Who are we really serving? That's something you need to be prepared for, especially as you grow and especially as we become responsible for some of these major performance indicators. It even just goes beyond being a KPI. It goes beyond you questioning yourself, am I in the right sector? Because if we all say we are here to serve the Kenyan, why doesn't this thing that is backed by evidence, that is backed by a commitment to help with implementation, or all these things, you have signed a petition, you've done all these things, then somebody somewhere, technocrat, says, nope, that's not how we do things. So it can be frustrating. So be prepared for an equal measure of frustration, because development has taken time and there's lots of money in this space, and I'm going to leave it at that. There's a lot of money that goes around in this sector. So yeah, if you know, But if you have any questions around, some of these intricacies and complexities of working in the sector, please give me a shout. Drop a comment. If you have any questions, please put your question in the comment box, and I'll make sure that I respond to you. And if you have any things you'd like us to delve a little bit deeper into around being in the development sector, working in the nonprofit in the NGO world, hit me up. Let me know what those things are. And hopefully in the next sort of career decision conversation, we can really have a chat with people who've had to make some 360 career choice decisions, just to get to hear some of the reasons, preferably those who've worked in the development space. So if you have any insights you'd like to share, let me know, and I'd be happy to bring you on for the next sort of part 3 of this career choice or career decisions conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in today. As always, please subscribe and share this message if you find it useful with many other people. And thank you so much for the guys who've come back to me with feedback around the lighting. Hopefully today I've done a better job. Thank you so much. This is the kind of feedback that I really appreciate, that will help us to make this useful to you, and also make sure that you can see me then as I speak, right? Other than that, thank you so much. Thank you guys. See you on the next one. Have an amazing day. Continue.